I call to order the Verona Plan Commission meeting, Monday, June 4th, 2018, at 6:32 p.m. First, we will have the roll.
Commissioner Tucker Long. Commissioner Manley. Here. Commissioner Bear. Here. Mayor Diaz.
Here.
Alder Gaskell.
Here.
Commissioner Lytle is absent and excused, and I believe Commissioner Heinzen is still on his way.
Great. We have a quorum. Next up, we will have the approval of the minutes from the May 7th, 2018 Plan Commission meeting. Questions, comments, motions on the minute? Commissioner Manley?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion by Commissioner Manley. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Bear. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. And the minutes are approved. Next up, we will have a public hearing regarding the zoning map amendment to rezone 101 Prairie Heights Drive from planned unit development to urban residential. Is there a, should we do a summary before the? Okay. Is there a motion to open the public hearing? Motion by Commissioner Bear. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Alder Gaskell. All those in favor of opening the public hearing say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. And we are in the public hearing. So if anyone from the public wishes to comment on the zoning map amendment to rezone 101 Prairie Heights Drive from planned unit development to urban residential, now would be the time to speak. All right, I've counted to 7 in my head. Last chance. All right, motion to close the public hearing would be in order.
So moved.
Motion by Alder Gaskell. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Bear. All those in favor of closing the public hearing say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. All right, and we are on to discussion and possible action.
Thank you. The request tonight is to rezone 101 Prairie Heights Drive from planned unit development to urban residential. Andy, if you could put the laptop up on the screens, please. This requires a public hearing before the Plan Commission, which we had tonight, and the Plan Commission then makes a recommendation to the Common Council on the zoning map amendment. The property in question is located at the southeast corner of Locust Drive and Prairie Heights Drive. It is highlighted in yellow on the screen before you. This property is part of a larger planned development that was initially approved in the late 1990s and about 1998. It's part of the Prairie Heights planned unit development. It's about 50 acres in size. Most of the development in this area has occurred. There still is a vacant lot that's just east of Navient. It's a future potential expansion for that company. But the rest of the area has been built out. The applicant tonight is requesting to zone this to urban residential. Urban residential is our what's classified as our multifamily district. We did list out in the planning staff report the uses that are allowed in the urban residential district. I won't go through those, but the primary use in that district is typically the apartment land use. I did speak with the agent for the property owner last week. She did indicate that there is currently an offer to purchase on the property that is contingent upon the rezoning of the lands to urban residential. Staff, as we kind of took a look at this, and you can kind of look at the map here too as well, the property once again is highlighted in black on the screen before you. The area in blue is anything that's zone plan development. Yellow is urban residential, and then the blue is suburban office. So this is all part of the larger kind of plan development in this area. Typically when these projects come forward for rezonings or changes like this, we have what's called an initial review before the Plan Commission. The applicant in this case elected not to go forward with the initial review and just to submit to rezone the property. The long-term plan for this was for this to be a non-residential type use. In the actual plan development, there was a potential office building that was located on this site. Obviously that hasn't gone forward. There was also a request in 2003 to rezone this to looking at more of a multifamily residential type use on it. That was denied back in 2003 by the Plan Commission on a 7-1 vote, with the primary concern being just the lack of time of this area developing. So tonight what we're looking at is that zoning map amendment. I think a couple of comments from staff on this is, typically when we look at these types of requests, they are tied with a project. Typically, we'll have a zoning map amendment, and then we'll also have a project right behind it. I think as it stands right now, staff does have some concerns of kind of doing this out of order of how we typically have done this. I think, if we're going to proactively start, zoning multifamily properties, we just need to be cautious because obviously, for those who have been on the Plan Commission and Council for a while, we have had, history of having properties that are zoned multifamily, the neighbors being surprised later on when the building starts being constructed. So, if there's a desire to rezone this right now, there are requirements within our multifamily phasing policy that it would require a sign to be placed in the property, at least notifying people in the future that there will be potentially multifamily on this lot, assuming this would be approved by the Common Council. As with all rezonings, findings of facts, there's 3 requirements that we go through as staff, and we have to determine if it meets the requirements. One of those requirements states which of the following factors has arisen that are not properly addressed on the current zoning map. 1, the designation of the official zoning map should be brought into conformity with the comprehensive plan. 2, a mistake was made in the mapping of the official map. 3, factors have changed, such as the availability of new data. And 4, growth patterns have changed. The application from the applicant is based upon growth patterns or rates of changing in the area and needing to make this amendment. At this time, staff doesn't believe that requirement actually has been met yet. We'd like to see a project behind it to show the need for that, a specific project with a site plan with details behind it before just going out and rezoning a piece of property. I think one concern that we have is that if this is zoned now this way, are we looking at the next step to be a planned development to potentially exceed our density requirements? It's just an easier conversation when you have a bigger package and a bigger picture when we take a look at these. The second requirement in the findings of facts is the third requirement actually is how does the proposed amendment to the official map maintain the desired consistency of land uses, land intensities, and land impacts on the related and surrounding environs. I think in general there's obviously multifamily across the street with the condos and the apartment buildings. To the east is Navient. I think the intent of this planned development was to have non-residential uses along 18151. That's kind of why you have these uses kind of lined up along here on the east side of Locust Drive, and also extending west into the industrial park. I think once again, from a staff level perspective, we don't think it's consistent with what's along 18151 in this area. I think staff would be open to the conversation of taking a look at this from a larger zoning application if there, like I said, if there was a project behind it that we could make a more qualified analysis on, but just to simply rezone it to multifamily without that project, it's difficult for staff to make that recommendation tonight. So I think any, kind of as we look at this, our recommendation to the Planning Commission is to recommend the council denial of the request tonight to rezone 101 Prairie Heights Drive. We think that if there's any discussion regarding this, it should be tied directly to a development project, no different than how we typically have done projects in the past. I think that's, to the neighbors as well and to the public, it's a fair conversation to have instead of just zoning it and then seeing what happens. It's an easier conversation if we're going to look at this and say, maybe it should be apartments, and this is why, because of the project that's with it. I think that's easier findings that we can make as staff. But I think if part of the larger conversation, we've got 2 other items on the agenda that kind of deal with the bigger question here. Is you've got property that was planned as a non-residential use, and we're looking at turning it to a residential use. And there's 2 other items on the agenda, and they're all separate items, different discussions. But once again, we're into the conversation here again about we have a property that was planned for a non-residential use, and we're going to potentially look at it as a residential use. At some point, as a city, we need to be conscious of that, of just trying to balance out the needs of residential land uses versus non-residential land uses. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. And I believe I saw the applicant was here, and they'd be happy to answer any questions as well.
Any questions from the commission? Alder Gaskell.
Hey, Andy, can you go back a few maps?
Adam.
Nope. Yes, so, so according to this, the parcel directly across the street was not residential, and at some point it must have been rezoned urban residential, so when did that happen?
So the blue, so it's interesting how we used to do plan developments in the city. So when we used to do plan developments, we used to zone the property as plan developments. You typically don't see that. You typically use a plan development as an overlay zone, and you keep the underlying zoning on it. So all the blue on the screen before you has been zoned plan development. And then for some reason, this was, and also these two pieces here in yellow have been zoned urban residential. We didn't pull, unless Ms. Holt knows the details on that from looking at the file. I'm not familiar with the details of exactly how that was zoned, but it was all part of that larger
Right.
plan development overall.
But I think the parcel directly across Prairie Heights, though, is actually multifamily right now. right?
Correct. I mean,
Okay.
you have multifamily in this location here.
Okay,
You have condos as your Wrap Meadow side. You have multifamily along
Got
Prairie
it.
Heights here. I mean, it's, yes, you're right.
Additional questions from the commission? Or comments? Commissioner Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd be curious from the applicant, or Adam, if you know the answer. One of your recommendations, or one of the staff's recommendations, was to suggest that the applicant list this as a commercial property. I'm curious if that's happened at some point in the past. It's obviously been a number of years since this property sort of came online. I'm curious what the history is, projects come and gone, if we know.
If the applicant would like to address the commission or answer that? And if you could identify yourself for the video stream.
Good evening, I'm Attorney Richard Wesley of Madison. I represent the applicant here. I submitted the application less than a month ago, and I want to express our appreciation for the prompt and thorough action that the commission has taken in getting it this far. Basically, the Realtor Maria Antoinette will be here to answer the specific question that came up, and I think it's probably the most important question of all, so it certainly deserves an answer. But the short answer is it just hasn't gone anywhere. And all I will say, in addition to what we've already submitted, we're not talking about multifamily immediately adjacent to residential. The nearest residential is all the way across the highway. It's a hill. I don't think you can see much of any of it from where we are. And this was all created in 1998. And I'd just be curious whether anybody in this room could envision what Verona would become 20 years later today. And the big thing there, among so many other things, is simply housing. And you need it, and we'd rather have people living here, commuting 2-3 miles if they're working at Epic or somewhere that supports Epic, instead of Madison or the areas in between. I think it's the highest and best use of the property. But I will let the realtor, Ms. Antoinette, explain the history of trying to sell this, excuse me, as a, beg your pardon, as a commercial property. Thank you.
Thank you. If you would.
I'm sorry, do you have a question? Don't mean to walk away.
Does anyone have further questions? Okay.
All right, thank
Is the real estate agent here, or? Oh, if you would, could answer the question.
So Maria Antoinette with Restaino and Associate Realtors. So it started being listed in 2014 with a different real estate company, and they did receive an offer, but it was contingent on rezoning. And of course that fell through. I took the listing in 2017, and we received an offer a couple days ago that would also like to be rezoned as a multifamily as well. So what would that be? 4 years, we received just 2 offers, and both for multifamily. Otherwise, the seller's been sitting on it since he purchased it back in 2005. So I really don't see, my professional opinion, it being sold as commercial unless he takes a huge cut in price, way below the assessed value.
Thank you. As long as we have the applicant up here, any further questions? Okay. Any questions, comments from the commission in general? Alder Gaskell?
What are our options here then for this? I mean, I'm struggling a little bit because we've had what I thought was a great opportunity for some apartments on Lincoln Street, and they didn't go anywhere. And part of that is a little bit of not in my backyard, and here we have multifamily existing already and sort of a perfect parcel to add more multifamily. We know vacancy rates are really low in the city for apartments. So I understand that we're doing this out of order. So process-wise, what are our options for tonight?
Process-wise, you could look at making a recommendation to the council for approval. You could recommend to the council denial. You could postpone action, but you'd have to give a reason why you're postponing or tabling action on that. So those are probably your two options.
So if we were to ask for some idea of what this multifamily might look like, even though it's an offer, so that's a lot to ask of somebody who's, would that satisfy staff's concerns?
I think
Some of them?
most offers that you see on I should say most, many times you see a project on the plan commission agenda, it has numerous contingencies behind it. That's pretty typical, where the offer is contingent upon obtaining all the entitlements from the municipality and all jurisdictions. So that is not from a real estate standpoint, and I'm not a realtor, but it's pretty common in what we see, at least as staff, that there's, contingencies before people buy it as well. So I mean, there's ways that, if the planning commission is open to it, I mean, you could postpone and try to get that information as well, because that would make the conversation easier.
Commissioner Heinzen?
Sure, thank you. Just a quick question for you.
Sure.
You said that if the property were to be sold for commercial, excuse me, if it was to be sold for commercial, that it would need to be sold for less than or considerably less than its assessed value. And I'm wondering whether or not you're saying you mean appraised value as opposed to assessed value.
Well, the assessment, I believe, is at, let me check here. Sorry, I should have.
No, that's okay.
2017 assessment is at $524,800, and listing price right now is at $525.
Okay. And,
So,
and I'll just ask Adam, I guess, if you know, is the property currently being assessed as likely commercial?
I don't know, but I would assume that would be the case.
Okay.
But I don't know to be a fact.
Right. Okay.
It is.
Okay. Thank you.
I had a question. In practical terms, what does this obligate us to? Like, if someone's going to put apartments there, we have density requirements, phasing requirements. What does this obligate us to approve? Because I'm always curious what leverage the city does and doesn't have.
So you're wondering if we rezone this to urban residential, what uses are permitted kind of by right?
I guess I'm looking. This is me trying to get clarity on what, let's say, apartments did go in there, what they would look like. Like, is the kind of thing if someone said we want to put 24 units there, or 12 units an acre, or whatever, would we basically be obligated to approve that then?
So apartments are conditional use, so they'd have to meet all the standards of the conditional use requirements of the zoning ordinance, and it also would have to meet all the requirements of the zoning ordinance as it relates to density, parking, setbacks, etc. Assuming that someone came in with a project that met all the requirements of the zoning ordinance, met all the requirements for the conditional use permit, it should be granted because of that. So where does it obligate you? I think parcel-wise, the size is just above 2 acres in size. So that puts you about 24, 25 units total. Obviously, there's parking taken into account, there's stormwater taken into account, setbacks. From a design standpoint, we have limited design standards, but we obviously, as staff, we have typical standards we enforce as part of the plan commission review process. But from strictly a unit standpoint, you'd be looking at that 24, 25-ish range.
So then if someone came with significantly more, we'd have discretion then, or the council would.
You'd be in the plan development route, so if someone came with more units, you'd have to go the plan development route, and then you're into the concept, the GDP, the PIP, et cetera.
Thank you. Questions, comments from the commission? Potential motions? Commissioner Manley?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess I have to agree with staff that I'm a little bit hard to review this without knowing exactly what, I think to the mayor's point, we would be buying for the city by doing this rezoning. I think it's a very appropriate place for multifamily. And if it has been, and I guess it's unclear to me how actively it's been marketed as commercial over the year, or over the years rather, surrounding, well, I guess I shouldn't say surrounding, properties immediately to the west developed as commercial without difficulty in the market. So I guess it's unclear to me why this hasn't developed as a commercial property. But as I said, I don't think it's unsuitable for multifamily. I'd just be a lot more comfortable doing the rezone, knowing what it would look like, knowing how dense it would be, how tall the buildings would be, whether or not there was any opportunity for some kind of mixed use out there.
Mhm.
There's a lot of multifamily right there, and there's not a single restaurant or bar or anything. It would be great if there was, some kind of something like that out there as a place where people could go in their neighborhood. So I guess from my perspective, I'm very open to the idea, but I'd be a lot more comfortable if I knew what the ultimate vision for the property is beyond the zoning
Okay.
change.
So if I come to the table with...
Go ahead.
Oh, is that okay? Sorry.
Yes.
If I come to the table with, say, a design of someone in this particular offer, what they're considering, is that something, I guess, that would be addressed then? Or I guess how would we proceed? Because I would definitely like to show a few options. I did think about possibly like a Subway, marketing people that own those and doing maybe some apartments above it for the neighborhood, because on the other side, as you know, there's a lot of homes and development there. There's condos, apartments, etc. But no, like you said, no restaurants, no food places, no ice cream shops, nothing like that. So,
Okay, Mr. Sayer, could you answer that? And then Commissioner Tucker Long?
Yeah, I think from a process standpoint, I mean, that's something that could be looked at by the plan commission. It would take typically what's called an initial review. You look at some basic site plans, some layouts that we've got one on tonight for Summit Credit Union. Something similar to that of, kind of looking at what the design is. The plan commission could take a look at it and kind of get a better understanding of what the site could look like, and then obviously based upon that feedback, the buyer could choose to go forward or not at that point, depending on what feedback they get from the plan commission or ultimately the council possibly too.
Thank you. Commissioner Tucker Long?
Thank you. I also would like to echo that I'm not against multifamily use here. It seems like a good place for it. I'm a little concerned about how close it is to the highway, just for noise and kid safety and things like that. But as far as developing it, it would be nice to see some more multifamily type apartments and things like that in town. It'd also be nice, this area, besides not having any sort of, businesses or restaurants and things, also has no parks. And there's a lot of family density in there with no parks at all. So that might be something we could take a look at as well when we evaluate this. But I have a question for Adam. Is this something where we could delay voting and they could submit some sort of site plan and then we could vote on this? Or do we need to vote tonight on this?
You don't need to vote tonight. I think you could postpone it, but I think at some point there's a time limit of at that point the city has to take action on a zoning map amendment. So you could postpone if the applicant obviously chose to withdraw this based upon that fact that we're going to get additional information, that would be more preferable because then the clock isn't running in essence. But you could choose to postpone and direct the applicant to kind of go back and have the buyer develop a site plan and some initial information that would be appropriate or possible.
Further questions, comments, potential motions from the commission? Commissioner Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll make a motion to table this item, perhaps with the sort of sentiment that give the applicant some options and come back to us with further detail sort of following this conversation.
Motion by Commissioner Bear, is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Alder Gaskell. Just to clarify, Mr. Sayer, does that make sense? Does that give you sufficient direction? Excellent. I don't have my Robert's Rules of Orders, but is a motion to table debatable? Okay. Questions, comments on the motion to table? All right. All those in favor of the motion to table, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. And we have tabled that for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, it's on the agenda. Item number 5 regarding the precise implementation plan amendment for Sugar Creek Commons development, which is located at the southwest corner of Verona Avenue and Legion Street. That item has been withdrawn, so I hope nobody was here for public comment, although if you were, I would encourage you to talk to your alders or to myself or Plan Commission members. With that, we will be on to item 6, discussion and possible action regarding a planned unit development concept plan review for a proposed 100-room hotel and a 10,000 square foot conference center to be located at 509 West Verona Avenue. Mr. Sayer.
Thank you. Andy, if you could put the laptop back up. The request tonight is for the hotel portion and banquet center for the Sugar Creek Commons development located along West Verona Avenue. The hotel and conference center is on the screen in this north-south orientation. To the east of this is the Sugar Creek Commons larger site that has been approved. To the east these are 2 mixed-use buildings, and then phase 2 off the back here, that's a multifamily building that was previously approved. The hotel has been looked at before by the Plan Commission from June of 2017. This was a submittal, included a 100-room hotel and a 5,000 square foot restaurant on the front of the site. In October of 2017, it was very similar, except the restaurant had been broken out as a separate building, and the hotel had been moved slightly to the back. And then obviously the submittal here tonight is once again, a 100-room hotel, 4 stories, and then a 2-story conference center that have about 10,000 square feet of space. From a bulk and a setback standpoint, the building does conform. It appears to conform to the required setbacks. Staff has no significant concerns with the building placement. There would be a patio out in the front of the conference convention area. That would be 2 stories in the front here, and there would be 4 stories off the back. From a parking and access standpoint, access would be shared with the Sugar Creek Commons project to the east, and there'd be a new access point to the west as well. A couple things on the access that staff would kind of like to point out is that this access point here is approximately 16 feet away from the St. Vincent de Paul access, immediately adjacent to the site. I think staff would like to see those 2 access points combined, just from a public safety standpoint and a convenience of use. Obviously, being that close to each other, it would make sense to have those combined into one. Other access points on the site plan, we do have, and Catherine did a nice job here, she kind of started up potential conflict points. We do a lot of stuff or things happening on the east side of the building here. This would be the drop-off location for the hotel. We also have a large kind of entrance point into the site. We have this east-west kind of access point as well that would ultimately connect to Legion Street. And then we also have the underground parking was recently kind of flipped to the west side of the building for the Sugar Creek Commons, that building there, it used to be on the east side of the building, right here, and the revised plans have it on the west side. I think from a staff perspective, we really want to have this underground access point move back to the east side. This drive here will have a lot of traffic, a lot of vehicles moving through it, complicated by the fact you have the drop-off for the hotel as well. We really think this needs to be moved back to the east. There's just a lot of moving parts in that area. From a strictly parking standpoint, the hotel would be required to have 111 parking spaces, and the conference center would have to have 167. Currently, for this portion of the site, they have provided 160 parking spaces. So they are, in staff's opinion, significantly short on the parking for this, especially with the size of a conference center as of this. So staff believes additional parking is required on the site, whether that be preferably underground. There's currently, I believe, 48 stalls underground for the hotel. Ideally, that parking would be placed underground. My computer's updating. Or I think ideally from staff's standpoint too, it would be nice to have a shared parking agreement with St. Vincent de Paul to the west. I think during larger events in the conference center, especially on the weekends, St. Vincent's isn't as busy as it is, during off-peak hours for both the uses. So we think additional parking is needed to kind of make this work, or for better or for worse, the conference center probably needs to shrink in size, because currently it is short on parking, and it's just not going to work from a parking standpoint. The site itself, they did not submit any designs of how the building would look. Obviously, staff would like to see those before we kind of provide comments and additional feedback on that. Staff is open to obviously developing the site as a hotel with a conference center use. We think it's a good use for West Verona Avenue. It creates more of a destination in this location. There's a lot of great kind of things happening in the spot, especially with this redevelopment project. So staff recommends the Plan Commission review the submitted materials and provide feedback to the applicants. I know the applicants are here tonight, and they'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you for that explanation. Questions, comments from the commission? Commissioner Manley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Adam, can you go back to the October 2017? Yeah, that one. And I'm having a hard time understanding, and maybe it's the parking that separated what was going to be a restaurant from the hotel, but how did the parking drop so significantly? Is that it? And was that up to code in terms of the amount of parking that was necessary for a 5,000 square foot restaurant and a 100-room hotel?
Sure. So I'm kind of looking at, I'm just flipping through these quickly. You've got 156, looks like in June. You've got 145 there in October. And then we have 112, which is on the surface, and then 40 below. So from a parking standpoint, the hotel, that hasn't changed much. That's roughly 110 parking spaces is required, so that's been consistent throughout. The restaurant is going to be based upon the number of seats, so it's based upon a seating capacity, so it's going to be 1 parking space per 3 seats, and that's the same requirement that we would have for a banquet center as well. The banquet number that we kind of provided an estimate in the report that was just kind of backing out typically industry standards of just what we thought would be the approximate seating of this facility, which we had about 500 people for 10,000 square feet. That made sense. So I don't know where the 145 and the 112 where that would happen. This would have worked a lot better just because of the restaurant number of seats you get in a 5,000 square foot restaurant isn't going to be. It's not going to be 500.
Right.
So from a parking standpoint, this would have worked much better, just from an overall number count standpoint. Obviously, when you add that component of a wedding or a convention venue, that changes the parking count significantly of demand-wise.
So if I could ask a further question then. The restaurant had a 5,000 square foot footprint, and the banquet center is 5,000 square feet, but 2 stories, so 10,000 total. Is there a way that could be, I guess they probably want the conference center physically connected to the hotel and not separated by a lot. Maybe that's the reason.
I would suspect that's the case, is because typically when you have a venue like that, you want them to be connected to the place you're staying. I mean, that's, even the last one we looked at in the city in Liberty Business Park with that convention.
Skyway.
That was connected by a skywalk, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, typically you want them connected by not having to walk outside in the elements.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Tucker Long.
Thank you. So with a 15,000 square foot hotel, you mentioned there's parking under there right now, 40 stalls. Is that as many stalls can fit there? Or like what kind of size are we looking at for a parking lot that would fit underneath that kind of space?
Well, we haven't seen the plans for the underground parking yet, so I mean, that's still forthcoming. I mean, there's options out there potentially. You know, when you look at underground parking, there is always the option if you can extend it beyond the constraints of the building. I mean, so that is an option, it's something they could look at. I'm not sure if Mr. Yeska has anything to add to that or not.
Hi everyone, Kevin Yeska with JSD representing Forward Development Group tonight. To answer that question there, that 40 stalls was a conceptual layout we just did, maximizing the footprint. In any ideal building scenario, if you can keep it under the footprint, it's going to be most cost effective. Anytime you start extending out from the actual foundation, it's added cost, added structural costs, concrete costs, etc. And to circle back on the last discussion there was the note in the staff report of 500 guests at the conference center itself. Probably be more in line of 250 to 275. So when we look at those numbers and look at the ratios of parking on site with the hotel, the underground, and then what would be required for the conference center itself, we'd be about 30 to 40 stalls short on the site. And that's where we would look to adjacent properties such as the St. Vinny's parcel, potentially the church, and Sugar Creek Commons to have a shared access and parking agreement between the owners. So still exploring those, and have some options out there, and happy to share those with our next submittal, and then also with staff to get that comfort level when we come back here with more detail. And I'm happy to answer any other questions as we go on here.
Any questions for the gentleman from JSD, or questions or comments in general? Commissioner Tucker Long.
Could you comment on the discussion we were talking about earlier where the previous one had like 160 parking spaces and now we're down to 112?
A couple things that I noticed right off the bat is the underground access drive wasn't included, so that's taking up an area of our site. The area between the conference center and the hotel, we look to have about maybe 40 stalls right there in that parking lot. That we initially had these two buildings combined, and we split them out once we were going with more of that restaurant play. And now when we went back to a 2-story conference center connected to the hotel, that's where we lost it. So things haven't drastically changed, but that's at about that 40 stalls in between the two buildings. That's where we lost a lot of it.
So has the footprint of the hotel itself changed? Because if you're just sliding it over and the footprint of the restaurant is the same as the convention center, you should still have that same amount of space and parking it's just on the other side.
You may be right there in that the parking or the hotel building may have lengthened a bit, and looks like it's a little bit wider in that option versus what we're proposing. We're at a very conceptual level right now, so things are morphing and larger placeholders at this time.
Anything further? Questions, comments from the commission? No, Mr. Sayre?
I guess one thing from the commission, if you have any comments, I guess staff would like to hear them regarding kind of off-site here, but adjacent to the hotel, just on this underground parking access point. Do you have any thoughts, questions, concerns on that? Obviously, staff has concerns on that, but any thoughts from the plan commission on that point.
Is this mixed use?
Correct, it's mixed use, so you'd have the front half along Verona Avenue be commercial, second and third above would be multi, and then there would also be some residential kind of back in this part too on both the first, second, and third floors.
And so is the parking under the whole building or just this portion that,
It's the whole building, so it'd be
Okay.
under, the entire L for each building along Verona Avenue. But they would not be connected, it'd be two separate underground garages.
Anything further?
so Adam, can you explain where you'd like to see it?
We'd like to see it kind of back to where it was. We'd like it back to the internal parking area. I know the applicant has some concerns about losing some of that internal parking for especially those commercial uses, which we agree is a concern, but we're more concerned just about the, I guess, safety aspect of people coming out of the structure, obviously at a grade, coming up, having to look right, having to look left. It's just there's a lot of stuff kind of happening at this point here with that drop off for the hotel. So we'd like to see kind of back on the east side of the building in the internal part of it.
Can I comment on that a little bit?
Sure.
Sure. In October, when we submitted that first iteration on Building B, whenever you're doing an underground access design, you try and target as minimal of slope as possible with a maximum of about a 12% pitch. When our submittal went in October, we had some refinement to do, and we were actually at a 16% slope going down to that underground on the east side of Building B. It's not a feasible drive down to that building. One option, and that was actually after we started to lift the different footprints of Building B. So the residential portion of B right now on, let's say, that southern face is exposed about 4 feet out of the ground. So if we were to go back to exploring the option of that underground access drive on the east side, we would have to lift the residential portion probably another 2 feet out of the ground and to get that underground slope to work. When we looked at it on the west side of the building, where I believe it was about a 6 to 8% slope. So much more manageable, a lot safer, especially for winter conditions, icy conditions, and it keeps that finished floor elevation of the residential at that 4-foot exposure versus, say, a 6 if we had to flip it back. You also do have a fairly awkward turn movement with that underground on the east side of the building, trying to get all those residents out of there, turning that corner and out onto West Verona Avenue, versus this has a little bit more direct connection to West Verona.
Commissioner Heinzen.
Sure, thank you. Excuse me, I have a couple questions related to this. Is it possible to, the first one is it possible to put the entrance on the south side of the building?
Most likely not, only with the proximity of the access drive and the building. We would have to shorten the building up or elevate it much, much higher out of the ground.
Okay. And the second question is, have you considered moving, I guess, the entrance to the hotel to not be in the center, but to be further to the south?
With the concept that we're working with, it does need to remain in the center without doing a complete interior remodel.
Okay.
And what's nice also about that central access is you do get a nice promenade to the hotel entrance all the way down West Verona Avenue, Sugar Creek Commons private drive there.
Yeah.
On Building B, we are still refining that concept, and there may be potential that underground access could shift north, getting it a little bit farther away from the main entrance hotel. So something we'll have to work through with the design team, the architect, as we come back with that PIP submittal here in a few months.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Manley, then Commissioner Tucker-Long.
Thank you. 2 questions, and I just heard your answer on the entrance to the hotel, and not shifting it north or south. Is it possible to put that on the west side of the building without having to make dramatic, so essentially a mirror image of its current configuration?
I guess the current entrance location gives the users a lot more opportunity for Sugar Creek Commons, with just walking throughout the spaces, the commercial retail that we're providing in building B and C. It creates that central node for everything. I can't give a great answer on that, I guess, in terms of flipping things,
Okay,
but something we'll consider and
sure,
definitely-
understood.
definitely note.
And then, Adam, if you could go back to the map, the black and white map that had the, yeah, that one. I wonder, and I can appreciate, you know, we all want to be mindful of pedestrian versus vehicle, you know, opportunities to have an accident, but I guess I'm wondering if there's any fewer or any less opportunity for car versus pedestrian conflict with that configuration as opposed to the other one where you're going to have people walking out of building B to their parked cars in that lot. I mean, at some point, you're going to have an opportunity for somebody to hit a pedestrian no matter where this thing is. And so I just wonder if this is even less of a conflict than having the entrance on the other side of the building.
Anything further?
No, that's it.
Commissioner Tucker Long.
I was actually just going to comment about flipping the entrance to the hotel to the west as well. And then it seems like you'd have a bigger parking space area for it as well then. And it keeps that turnaround where people have to pull in and out and then try to find parking out of sort of the driveway area and the road crossing. And then you could have a smaller door with a pedestrian walkway out the back to still give them access to those buildings.
Sure, understood, noted, thanks.
Alder Gaskell.
Can you go back to the conflict map, please, Adam? I feel like at least here, all of the access is in one place. So maybe there's a potential for congestion, but you know where they are, and you, as a pedestrian, are aware that they're all in one place versus spreading them out over the site. And I guess I don't think it's fair to ask the applicant to sort of redesign the landscape architecture and the way the site is set up just to flip an entrance for the hotel. I mean, it's purposely this way to look back down into the site. Aesthetically, it's much more pleasing this way. So just to deal with a few parking spots and maybe one conflict point, I don't think we should be asking them to flip it. I mean, there's a point to the way that this is designed. It's not just to maximize parking, but also so that these pieces fit together aesthetically, which is something we're always sort of wanting to see anyway with our developments. So I assume all of the stippled part, those are the sidewalks. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe we just need to ask for more attention to crossings. I don't know if that's a pavement treatment, you know, colored concrete, something so that
Sure.
wherever pedestrians are crossing, it's very apparent.
Yeah, there's definitely successful ways you can slow traffic. Narrowing drives always helps. Chicanes, stop signs always help. Crosswalks, definitely things we can propose here. And then, say for the underground access of D and maybe that conflict point, people living there will probably find the most efficient way to get out of their apartments and will most likely head west and then out along the west side of this hotel. Maybe, maybe not. Another thing we could consider and look at is actually flipping the underground access drive to alleviate a lot of that traffic. You take the hotel's underground access drive, you bring it out the west side of the building. Again, we're at the conceptual stage, but that's something we'll take a look at and see if the site grading can work with it.
That would work really nicely, because then you just have the access through the hotel parking only, right? Can you explain what the turnaround is, or is this just sort of a holdover space right now?
The St. Finney's
Yeah,
turnaround is their semi-traffic turnaround,
got it,
their
okay.
bulb.
So where would semis access the hotel for any reason then, from that spot?
We're actually looking to try and have the conference center utilize the underground access, have their deliveries come underground,
Okay,
right through a garage door and then into the conference center. So or very late night return, or very late night drop-offs, but
so that being said, I do think it would be a really great idea then if you flip it, the underground access, because I didn't even think about semis coming through here. I'm just thinking about auto traffic, so if you're bringing semis through there, yeah, that significantly changes the conflict.
shouldn't be any semis coming directly through our development. They would be using the St. Vinny's lot, using that bulb to turn around and access the St. Vinny's building. But we would have smaller catering trucks for deliveries, definitely, for the hotel and conference center.
Commissioner Tucker Long and Commissioner Barrett.
So one more question on the turnaround here. With the conference center being large, if there's a large event there and people are checking in all at the same time, is there a potential for the driveway into Building B to get blocked by people waiting to get in? Or I know at conferences I've been to, people have a tendency to park their car. If the turnaround is full, they just sort of park it in the road to run in and check in. And if that driveway gets blocked, is there any other way for those people to get out of that building, the parking lot underground?
There would not be, no. Currently, building B and C of Sugar Creek isn't connected with an underground.
Commissioner Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm curious about sidewalk access here, that there's seemingly a sort of missing link on the east side of the building connecting to the north to the sidewalk. Is that intentional or?
No.
Okay.
Noted. Yeah, we'll make that connection, no problem.
And then sort of similar question, I know it's not in this agenda item, but for, buildings B and D similarly don't have that
Sure.
Sidewalk access.
I have several comments myself. I think that it's really important to have good signage in this location, just with potential mixed use, with the hotel, with the conference center. There's going to be like a lot of people who don't normally live there going through there, and a lot of people walking. And hopefully it's really successful. But it's really important for me just seeing people in Middleton, which has a lot of commercial stuff, and seeing how bad people drive when they get into areas they're not familiar with. I think it's really, really important that there's going to be some good signage just to prevent anything bad from happening, and so people are clear with what's up. I really, really like the idea of shared parking. Obviously, that's dependent on you guys working something out with the neighboring property owners, but I think it's a great use, and that ensures that parking lots don't stand empty and that they're being used as much as possible. And I also would like to see a combined driveway with St. Vinny's. Further comments, questions? Question to the applicant, would you say you've got enough feedback?
This is perfect. Thank
Okay.
you. Exactly what we needed.
Fantastic. Unless anyone has anything further to add, we will move on to item 7, discussion and possible action regarding an initial site plan review for a proposed 3,687 square foot Summit Credit Union to be located at 407 and 409 West Verona Avenue. Mr. Sayer?
Thank you. Andy, if you could put my computer back up. Request tonight is for an initial review to allow for the construction of a Summit Credit Union at 407 and 409 West Verona Avenue. The property in question is highlighted on your screen in yellow. This is the former location of Michael's Frozen Custard, also Tread's Restaurant, and also includes the house next door to that as well too. The applicant is looking obviously to redevelop the site to construct a Summit Credit Union bank. The building itself would be set back 15 feet from Verona Avenue. This site is located within the downtown overlay district, so there are minimum and maximum setbacks. The minimum setback is 15 feet, the maximum setback is 25 feet. Staff initially has no concerns with the building setbacks. It conforms the code requirements. We also don't initially have any concerns with the actual pavement setbacks as well too. That overlay district also requires a minimum building height of 20 feet, which as we get into in the future here, it does conform to that as well. As part of this, there would be 3 drive-through lanes. The lanes would be located southwest of the building. We have not reviewed that for the minimum stacking distances in front and behind the site. So there is a 100-foot stacking requirement behind the drive-through lanes and a 40-foot stacking requirement once you pass through. Initially, though, it appears that it does meet those requirements. The applicant is proposing 2 access points to the site. The eastern access point would be an exit only. This would provide direct access to the night drop on the east side of the property. And then there would be both an in and out access point on the west side of the site. The applicant did work with staff on pushing this access point as furthest east that we could possibly get it. We did initially have some concerns when the point was over here because it was close to the adjacent business. However, the applicant has pushed that to the east even further, and staff has no concerns with where that is now located. Stormwater management details will be reviewed as the project moves forward. The applicant will need to work closely with the city engineer on those plans, as there is no storm sewer lines near this property. So it's a workable issue, but they'll have to work closely with the city engineer on that. The building itself would contain both brick and metal. It'd be a high quality building. There's a similar project in Monona Drive. If you've been over there, it would look very similar to that project that was recently constructed as well. It would conform to the 20-foot height requirement. It would have more of a modern type look and actually would blend quite well with the Sugar Creek Commons project that's located to the west of the site. Initially here, staff has no initial concerns with the project. We think it's a nice redevelopment opportunity for the city. And with that, the applicants are here tonight, and they'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And so would staff. Thank you.
Thank you for the explanation. Questions, comments from the commission? Commissioner Tucker Long.
In the bulleted list here, you list 2 lots. Are those 2 parking lots, or it's 2 lots of land?
So there's 2 parcels. So on the screen here, you've got the house currently sits on this parcel. You can see the parcel line dashed kind of through the middle here. And the second parcel is on the east side here. That's where the former Treads restaurant is located. So as part of this, they would have to do a certified survey map to combine those parcels into one.
Other questions, comments? Alder Gaskell?
Mr. Sayer, do we have standards of pervious to impervious surface for projects? It just looks like a lot of pavement to me, and maybe it's just because it's black on this, but it looks, 53% of the site is impervious.
Correct. I don't recall what the number is off my top of my head. I know this is zoned urban commercial. It's typically we have a higher standard for impervious surface. I want to say it's probably closer to 75%, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
I do think it is the color on the screen because the black it's very overpowering. So that's something that we will check though as we get closer, as we get further along in this. But I think it's the color doing that, not the standard. I think the standard's gonna be met at the end of the day.
I had very similar impression as well. That it looks like a lot of impervious surface, and I would love to see as much green space and landscaping as possible. Questions, comments from the commission? Commissioner Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm also curious about the placement of the trash enclosure, sort of next to one of our busiest streets. If there's a spot that could be moved towards the back, maybe loop the garbage truck through the parking lot somehow. Not a deal breaker, at least not for my vote, but something we'd like to see.
Great. Questions, comments? Commissioner Heinzen?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would just note that, the building structure looks very attractive. It will be a great addition to Verona, and particularly to this lot. And, if Michael's custard could be, provided once in a while to the customers, that'd be great. But no, it looks great.
Commissioner Tucker Long?
I think the only comment I have, kind of going back to what Alder Gaskell was saying, is I feel like a lot of the pavement is being used just to drive around. There's a lot of just routing traffic around the parking lot and back across and things like that. So maybe we could find a slightly more efficient traffic routing to utilize less pavement.
Commissioner Manley?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just would echo the comments of Mr. Heinzen and think it's a very nice looking building. I think it looks very consistent with the requirements of the design overlay for the downtown area, and I think it would be, just despite the fact that many of us wish we could still get custard there, I think it would be a huge upgrade over the building that's on that larger lot currently.
Further questions, comments? Mr. Sayre?
Sure. The one thing that I know Alder Gaskell raised on the impervious surface, there is a 10% minimum landscaping requirement, so 10% of the site has to be green. So I don't think that's going to be a problem, but we can definitely work with the applicant on just seeing if we can reduce some of the impervious surface, and then also taking a look at that dumpster enclosure location as well too.
Thank you. Further questions, comments? Seeing no further, hopefully the applicant got the necessary feedback. We will move on to the next agenda item. We are on to item 8, discussion and possible action regarding a planned unit development concept plan located at 102, 104 Lincoln Street. There are 3 different development options that we're going to discuss, including office use, light industrial use, and a 90 multifamily unit apartment building. Mr. Sayre.
Thank you. This is a plan development concept review before the Plan Commission tonight. And as Mayor Diaz explained, there's 3 options that were submitted by the applicant. This property has obviously a history. I think some of you are familiar with it, some of you are not. The history was included in the Plan Commission packet. The most recent review of a project on this site was in March of 2018, and where both the Plan Commission and Common Council discussed a general development plan, a GDP, for this site for a project that contained 90 apartment units. It would have been a 3-story building that created a backwards L shape along Lincoln Street and along the bike trail as well. The Plan Commission discussed that in March of 2018. Comments from the Plan Commission included praise of the applicants regarding community outreach, a good use of high-quality building materials, and quite a questions about what the heights were of the surrounding properties. The Plan Commission ultimately voted in March 5-0 to recommend to the Common Council approval of the general development plan. The Council ultimately discussed the project as well in March of 2018. Concerns kind of raised by the Council included concerns about traffic, having adequate on-site parking, concerns about stormwater management, a desire to develop the site as a single-family use versus multifamily use, and then the effect of additional traffic on emergency response times as it relates to the fire and EMS station, and the compatibility of this development with the rest of the neighborhood. Ultimately, the Council voted 5-3 to deny the GDP, so that's kind of why we're back here tonight discussing the property. Andy, if you could put the computer back up on the screen, that'd be great. So the site itself is actually located just across the street here from City Hall. It's just west of the VACT building, just southwest of the fire and EMS station. That's along Lincoln Street. Andy? Thank you. So once again, the property in question, it's the former home of the Secor property. So Secor was formerly located on there. They've constructed a new facility. I believe they fully have moved out of there now. So the building is vacant, or will be vacant if it is not very shortly. So the site obviously needs a use to it right now. So before we kind of get into the options, the property is currently zoned suburban industrial. And the uses of that district are listed on the screen before you. As part of this, when we looked at it 2 months ago, obviously for an apartment redevelopment type use like that, they would have to rezone that to urban residential. So I think right now what the applicant's looking for is, obviously there's a current zoning to the property, and it allows a variety of uses. That includes, we have, an office use that'll be discussed tonight. We have a light industrial, which is an allowable use. You could potentially do indoor commercial entertainment. That's the gamut of restaurants, or it's a fitness facility. Those are indoor commercial entertainment land uses. Indoor storage, personal storage facilities, a conditional use permit, that'd be mini storage. Obviously light industrial land uses, and then you have the potential uses that we discussed 2 months ago on the right side of what would be permissible if it were to be rezoned for an apartment type use. Just as staff, we wanted to point that out, as obviously as this conversation continues, there's the applicant is allowed to use the property in some function, and obviously the property is zoned right now as suburban industrial. And I just want to make the Plan Commission aware that anyone coming in to use that property, say as a, indoor institutional use or a permitted use on here, such as an office as it stands today, so long as they meet the requirements of the code, they can move in there. It won't go before the Plan Commission. It will just be an allowable use by right. Obviously, if it's a conditional use, it comes before the Plan Commission, but I just want to make the Plan Commission know that obviously it has an industrial zoning, which is, quite honestly, we typically don't find that in neighborhoods like this. So the applicant did look at three options, two of which could actually be done under the current zoning. Option A, which is on the screen before you here, is an office type use. Kind of before I get into this, there are a couple unique features to this site. There is an existing storm sewer easement that runs through this dashed line here. That is it contains a 60-inch pipe. So it's a very large pipe that most likely will not be relocated. And there's also a 42-inch pipe along this easement on the southwest corner of it. So these are two rather large constraints that the property has. But they did provide a potential 3-story office building that would have 47,000 square feet of space. It would have 157 stalls. And this site plan or concept, I guess here, this would actually conform to the requirements of that suburban industrial district. So that would be a site plan review potentially before just the Plan Commission. The second option that they provided was looking at an addition onto the existing facility, which would provide a total of approximately 33,000 square feet of space for a potential light industrial. It'd be a 1-story building, and they would have approximately 84 stalls. Once again, this would be a site plan review before the Plan Commission. And then ultimately it was option C. Option C is the option that was discussed by the Plan Commission and Common Council in March of this year. It has 90 units, 3 stories, and then 150 total parking spaces. So those are the 3 options that they submitted tonight to kind of gain feedback and thoughts from the Plan Commission. I think as staff, as we went through this, obviously we have options A and B. Those would just be through a site plan approval. Those wouldn't need any exemptions from the Plan Commission or the Council. Option C would need a plan unit development and exemptions for the parking and also for the setbacks as well too. I think as we looked at also from just laying out kind of the concerns and comments on both these, parking, we think parking probably for all of them works fine. Access for both A, which you have the access point on the north side of the site where staff has been encouraging the applicant to locate it for potential shared access in the future if the property to the north were to redevelop. And option C has the access point on the north side, and then option B is kind of holding that existing access point as well. I think as we looked at the access, our preference continues to be to try to keep the access to the north. We think there could be a shared access opportunity in the future. I think the one comment obviously with the industrial is just if a user has larger semis coming in, that could create some challenges on the property, especially on the street as well. So that's something that we all have to just be cognizant of and just work through if that's the case. From a traffic standpoint, we did have a very brief conversation with our city traffic engineer. He did not do an analysis on this. We just had like I said, a conversation with him. Overall, all 3 options, in his opinion, didn't raise any issues. According to our traffic engineer, he said the office use would generate the most traffic and most trips during the course of a day. He did quantify that by saying it depends on what kind of office. So if it's an office that has appointment based, you have people coming and going, obviously it's gonna generate more than an office use that has people arriving and is leaving at night. But he did suspect that the office use would drive the most traffic. He said that the second most trips would be from the apartment land use, and then the third most trips would be from that light industrial land use potential, that option B. Either one, though, in his opinion, wasn't going to create any issues on the site, but like I said, the office would be the highest generator. Light industrial would be the least amount of generator traffic. As we talked about before, this property was included in the downtown mobility and redevelopment plan that was adopted in March of 2014. That plan did identify this site for redevelopment as a multifamily land use with 72 units. I think obviously long-term, the redevelopment of the property as a multifamily use is consistent with that plan that was adopted, 4 years ago. I think in general, as staff has looked at this from our standpoint, we're supportive of the redevelopment of this site. I think from which development option is the best or that we have feelings on, we can work on all three of them. There isn't one out there that is a potential red flag. I will say with the industrial type use on there, with the potential light industrial use, that has the potential to create issues with adjacent properties. You have the potential for noise. You have the potential for odors, depending on what's going on in the facility from a welding standpoint or depending on what's occurring there. So it does have the potential to create some potential land uses on there. But we could support potentially option A, B, or C on here. So with that, staff recommends the Plan Commission and the Common Council review the submitted materials and provide feedback to the applicant. This will go to the Common Council next Monday, also for discussion and no action, just like tonight. We did have 4 questions in our staff report, and that relates back to kind of what are the feelings from the Plan Commission on the options that were submitted. Is the Plan Commission open to the office option A option on the development option on this site? Is the Plan Commission open to option B, which is the light industrial idea for the property? And then ultimately option C, which is the redevelopment as an apartment use, is the Plan Commission open to that? And then ultimately, if the Plan Commission isn't open to any of those 3 options, what kind of use are you looking for on the property? Obviously, it's allowed certain uses by right, but what do you want to see the property used for? Obviously, the plan had recommended it for apartments. What are the thoughts from the Plan Commission, though, if the 3 options tonight, in your opinion, don't work? So, I know the applicant is here tonight. They're looking for feedback and direction on kind of how they can use the property, how they can redevelop the property. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, and staff is happy to answer any questions as well.
Thank you for the explanation. Commissioner Heinzen.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess I'll start with a couple of comments. I think that of the choices, option A and option C, to me, both look like reasonably decent options. I have a question with respect to parking. All these properties or all these options, then as well with A in particular. But so there's a sewer pipe going beneath the property, and so there's an easement there. But does the easement, be surprised if the easement prohibits parking on top of it? And maybe it does, but that's if it doesn't prohibit it, there's a fair amount of place for further parking further away from the road, and I guess there's always the danger that someday the city has to rip open the sewer. But Adam, do you know?
You could have parking on there. So some of the previous examples that we looked at actually had a drive. The drive aisle actually extended over into this area, and there were some parking spaces there. So no, pavement's not a problem. The big issue obviously is a building.
Yeah.
I think from a parking standpoint, just as you look at the 47,000 square feet and the 157 stalls, from an office use standpoint, it requires 1 space per 300 square feet of building space. So
Okay.
The number from a code standpoint, and the 157, as we looked at it, does back out to that 47,000 square feet.
Okay, thanks. And I guess my last comment then with respect to option A is that I would certainly prefer to have the office building closer to Lincoln Street, similar to how the residential or the apartments were, with the parking behind it. Particularly with the buildings that are across the street, I think is, you know, much more aesthetically pleasing, certainly.
Commissioner Manley and then Commissioner Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've been supportive of option C in the past, and I remain supportive of it. And I think that if we look at the other types of land uses that are in existence in the surrounding areas, it makes the most sense to have a residential type use. I think that there was a lot of thought and consideration and discussion with neighbors with respect to option C in order to site the buildings and the parking in a manner that would be least intrusive to the folks who actually live immediately to the west, and even further down to the south. So I think just from a planning standpoint, I think option C is the one that makes the most amount of sense to me, particularly as we continue to redevelop the downtown and having this type of a use where people can, walk to restaurants and so forth. I think that makes an awful lot of sense. I do think also that if we're thinking in terms of what's going to generate the most amount of value, and I know we're not necessarily supposed to think about that at the Plan Commission, that's sort of a city council issue, but this plan probably maximizes the property tax revenue that we get out of this parcel, which I think is a sort of a nice additional feature. I also agree that option A is very much a viable option for this property as well. I can understand, I would normally agree that I would prefer moving the building closer to Lincoln Street and having parking behind it, but because of the neighborhood impacts, I think that actually having the building where it is probably serves as a better buffer between the use that would be going on that parcel and the neighbors to the west. So, although I'd be very interested in hearing their input on that if that's the direction that the developer wanted to go. But I'm in agreement with staff that any of the three, I guess, would be viable, but my preference would be C.
Commissioner Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with those comments that, this is one where I think the comprehensive, the downtown plan got it right, that the best use of this space is a mixed or a multi-use, multi-family residential use. I'm curious if perhaps Mr. Sayer can address some of the concerns that led to the denial at the Common Council that are listed top of page 4 of the planning report. Traffic concerns, adequate on-site parking. So what's been added? You did address the traffic concerns with the discussion with the traffic engineer. The stormwater management, what's different, if anything, is hard to tell here from the maps alone. And I think we've sort of discussed the compatibility with the rest of the neighborhood, that the downtown plan probably got this right, that this is the option C is the best use of this. But those other two things, on-site parking and stormwater management.
Sure. The parking concern, if I recall correctly, stem from just the events that are occurring at VACT, events occurring kind of in the general area, especially with the hometown days last weekend, and just a general concern that, are there going to be parking issues, especially along Lincoln Street? It's exasperated by this project potentially, or are people going to try to park in here as well too? So that was the, if I recall correctly, the bigger concerns that were raised with that. The stormwater were just concerns that, is it going to make, create stormwater issues on the site? I know the applicant did include in the Plan Commission submittal a memo from Quam Engineering, just kind of outlining some of the stormwater features that they'll be, utilizing as part of this project, and then just a brief summary of what what they're looking at. I mean, in general, typically when sites redevelop, generally the stormwater does improve, especially when there isn't a pond on the property. So you now have the ability to catch the water on the site and retain it and treat it. But Quam did include that or they did include that in the package just to try to address that concern, because the question came up at the council to staff, especially of, what's going to, will stormwater get better? And quite honestly, until we get the report, we can't give a definitive answer on that. Typically does it? Yes, typically, but until we have able to review that, we can't say that with certainty. So those two items, that was the reason those came up.
Alder Gaskell.
For the sake of transparency, I was one of the 3 alders that supported this from the beginning, and I still do. I think the highest and best use of this parcel is option C by far. And unlike my other fellow commissioners, I would not want to see light industrial here. I think it'd be really disappointing if we ended up with self-storage in this parcel. What's interesting to me, I think, is that some of the concerns of my fellow alders were parking and congestion and stormwater, and there's really no difference between option C and option A for those. So we could have an office building that has just as many parking issues and more condensed probably because people will be coming in and out at the same time. But I'm glad to see this back. I think this is a great use for this parcel here, and certainly, we've talked about multifamily and did a lot of work going into this, and I'm glad to see it back.
Thank you. Commissioner Tucker-Long.
I'm also in favor of option C. I am a little concerned about the parking because Lincoln Street isn't really a great place to park. There's not a lot of access off of Lincoln Street to park necessarily. And so if we have 90 units, efficiencies likely maybe only will have 1 car, but 1 and 2 bedrooms are likely to have 2 cars. And there's already not enough parking spaces if you only count 2 cars in the 1 and 2 bedrooms. And so that doesn't include anybody who's coming to visit the people living here as well. There's no parking left for them. And so I would be concerned that people would start parking across the street or parking poorly on the street and things like that. So parking is a big issue for me. Also, if we're doing this, I'd like to see some sort of playground or something for the kids nearby. I mean, there is the playground across the street at Veterans Park, but it'd be nice to have something here as well.
Thank you. Additional comments? Questions? I'll make a comment myself. I was one of the alders who opposed for the reasons outlined in the report. I'm still opposed to option C. Regarding option A, I would hope it would be designed in a way to minimize impact on the neighborhood. Further questions or comments from the commission? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next agenda item. Okay, just to clarify, that'll be on the city council agenda for feedback on Monday. All right. Number 9, discussion. This is the initial concept review for a proposed 160-acre residential development to be located at 7230 Pine Row Road in the city's southwest neighborhood adjacent to Valley Road. Mr. Zaire?
Thank you. Andy, if you could put the computer up on the screen, please. Thank you. So the property in question is highlighted on yellow on the screen before you. This, as most of you recall, this was on the agenda at the May 2018 Plan Commission meeting. Once again, we're looking at potentially 200 age-restricted units, 200 age-restricted kind of independent living units, 60 age-restricted garden homes, 48 memory care units, 12 assisted living units, and then approximately 270 single-family homes in this location here. So it was discussed in May. The Plan Commission directed staff to determine if there was a potential better location for looking at relocating some of the non-residential uses. So this site has been planned as a non-residential use, and looking at alternatives to kind of changing that designation. So the conceptual plan that was included kind of in your packet is kind of before you in the screen here before you. Once again, we have the kind of the senior area in the yellow and red, and then we have the blue kind of area for the single family. So between the May meeting and this meeting, staff did, we went out, we researched it, and I'll do a brief as I can presentation on just our findings and our thoughts on, the bigger question here that was being asked of the site was planned as a non-residential, for non-residential uses, and obviously the applicant's looking at putting a residential use on this property. So, as we looked at that, we kind of looked at initially, okay, what do we have in the city right now? So this is the zoning map of the city. Anything that you kind of see in the yellowish color, either light yellow or bright yellow, that is a residential classification. The orangish type color, which is through here, that's typically sometimes our duplex or sometimes even our multifamily classification. Suburban industrial is purple, so here we have with Epic, and then we have the southeast area, which is also Liberty Park, the Technology Park. We have the old industrial area of the city along South Nine Mound Road. I shouldn't say old, but one of the originals. And then we have commercial along East Verona Avenue, additional commercial along East Verona Avenue, and then central commercial in the city. So this is the existing stock of what we have today. And what we did was then we actually Ms. Holt created a map that was then looking at all the land use plans that we've adopted and looking at what those plans are recommending. So this is a combination of all the plans that we have in place right now. So kind of starting in the Northwest, this is the recent Northwest neighborhood plan that was adopted. And she did the best she could. I'm trying to look at those because the uses don't line up, but just looking at it from a residential, institution, non-residential, commercial, and transition standpoint. So we obviously have the Northwest plan here. Lands through here just south of the Northwest plan is the North Neighborhood plan. Once again, we have the kind of lands plan for Epic in this location here. We have the Southwest plan, which is being discussed tonight. The Southwest plan is for these 440s in this location here. We also have the land over here in the Southwest plan. And then we have the Southeast neighborhood plan, which includes Liberty Park on the north side of County Highway M and the Verona Technology Park on the south side of County Highway M. So this is just the overall big picture, all our plans kind of on one screen of what we're looking at. So the areas that we have planned for non-residential are predominantly Epic. This area in the Southwest that we're talking about tonight, and then also this area that we have in the Southeast plan as well. So once again, just the blow up of the Southwest plan. Once again, just looking at this is the property in question. This is the plan highlighted on the screen before you. This whole area along the west side of 69 that was planned as for non-residential uses. So as we looked at this, we kind of broke the conversation up into two different pieces. We looked at it from two different aspects. We looked at it first of all from they're looking at a 160-acre development for residential development. Is there a spot that you could put a 160-acre development reasonably or close by within the city's growth area? And the second aspect of it was kind of what the Plan Commission alluded to a month ago was looking at this non-residential piece and trying to figure out where we could move that non-residential piece. So we looked at it from that two-step aspect of where we could move the project to an area that was planned for residential, and then also looked at where we could possibly change the designation of lands in our long-term plans to non-residential. So I guess we'll start first, is there other spots you could possibly look to move this project or development that is possibly available? The first one we have that is actually in the market today is the Durford property along Whalen Road. This is just east of the city of Verona. There's approximately 160 acres, mostly contiguous to each other. This is in their southeast neighborhood plan. This was planned as residential. It's an area B for the town boundary agreement. It would require a USA, would require water and sewer, would require the full gamut of approvals, but it has been planned as residential. So this is one of the areas that we kind of looked at as obviously the developer doesn't want to locate it there, but this is land that is planned and available for residential. Second one we looked at, probably not as viable as the first one, but it's the Hagman property along County Highway M, along Fitzroy. It's 114 acres. This would require sewer and water from the city. This one's a little bit more difficult to develop. It's not adjacent to the city. It would require sewer and water extensions, and to be quite honest, we're not exactly sure if it could even be served by those services easily. So, but it's an option that obviously is out there, but probably not the most viable option. look towards the northwest. This is the plan we adopted a few months ago. So we looked at the northwest plan and said, is there land in there that could possibly be developed? And you have multiple property owners, but you do have land that is mostly tied up and contiguous in large pieces. It was planned for residential growth. Water and sewer in some of these areas, once again, could be challenging. And it's also in growth area B, but it is contiguous, and it could be possible to assemble up to 160 acres. And finally, we also looked at the Herfel property, which is south of Scenic Ridge and Cathedral Point. The school district actually acquired this piece a few years ago for a future elementary school. But once again, this is planned as residential, requires sewer and water, requires USA, requires a variety of approvals, requires it's not on the market, so require the property owner to sell it. But once again, it was planned as residential. So those are the initial areas we looked at of, okay, what areas do we have planned as residential that you could possibly conceivably pick the project up and drop it someplace else. The second aspect that we looked at was looking at, okay, if we could change the designation of a land use someplace to non-residential, what is the most feasible, what is the most logical locations that we could look at? And to be quite honest with you, our options in that are going to be more limited in the previous conversation. We have more land planned for residential than non-residential. So it's a lot easier to try to pick something up that's residential and move it around versus saying we need to change something to non-residential. But there are some options out there. I think the first option that we looked at once again was the Herfel property. So the site that we're looking and talking about tonight are these 440s located here. The Herfel area is within stone's throw. It's along State Highway 69. There could be some feasibility of trying to change the designation of a land use in the southern part here to a non-residential land use. It would be abutting a quarry, non-metallic mine. That's a use that could fit. You are getting further away from 18151, but you're still along a state highway that would have good access for an industrial, non-residential type use. So that was one of the options that we did consider. I think the second option that we looked at was we have these transition areas. These transition areas are intended to be a buffer between the non-residential uses on the west side of it to the residential uses on the east side. One could simply look at this map and just say, well, everything that's kind of blue on the screen here, we could turn that to brown. That would come up to about 240 acres. It would accommodate the acreage that's being lost as part of the southwest area kind of amendment. There are some cons, I guess, to that, is that once again you're getting further away from 18151. You're not along a state highway, like this land would be adjacent or very close to a state highway in the southwest area. But you could simply look at trying to adjust some of the transition areas, or if need be, you could also adjust some of the residential areas on the east side as well too. Obviously, that's part of the overall southeast neighborhood plan. And to be clear as well, I think over the years, we've done some rezonings in Liberty Park as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, that we changed some of the land that was zoned industrial to commercial. And we've also had a proposal, once again, 2 or 3 years ago, for potential multifamily at the intersection of M and County Highway PB. So, there's options out there. I don't think there's any, from a staff standpoint, there weren't any options that really jumped off the table as, okay, this is easy, this is simple, we can easily move this or accommodate elsewhere. But there are options out there, and as staff, we've had obviously no conversations with these landowners in this location to get their feedback on this, but that would be something we'd have to do as well too. We did in the packet include a letter from the senior director at the senior center. Obviously, a large portion of this site would be planned for senior and used for senior housing. I think generally the comment from the senior center is that, approving a development regardless of the location of a development of this size would have impacts potentially on the senior center. It would probably increase or, potentially increase the need or potential to possibly expand the senior center. Would also potentially increase the needs for staffing of that facility. Obviously, those aren't known until it would actually be built and implemented, but there would be impacts on it, creating potential long space and staffing concerns and issues for the senior center. So she couldn't give us a concrete answer, but simply put, more seniors, probably more usage of the senior center. We did reach out to the school district also regarding kind of the development of the property. We did not receive any feedback from them, but they are aware of the proposal. They are aware that we are looking at potential, residential in this area. I think the one comment I think I had from the superintendent was in the southwest area, we've looked at this potential road coming out of the southwest plan that would connect into the high school one day over 18151. Obviously, that would push those conversations more quickly than we all anticipated. So I think, and I've got a lot more details in the staff report as well, which I won't get into. I think from a staff standpoint here is that you have 160 acres that obviously is planned as non-residential. The applicant's looking to change it to residential. If there's a desire to change something, the most logical location is going to be that southeast neighborhood plan. It'd be pushing those transition areas and changing those from that blue color to transition to that brown color of non-residential. But like I said, we've seen increased pressure, and there's 2 items in the agenda tonight we looked at talking about changing land that was non-residential to residential. There's a lot of pressure out there too, obviously with the residential demands we have in the apartment market, also the single family market. There's a lot of demands out there for that. So there's no easy answer for the plan commission. There's no easy place to say this is where it needs to go. It's not a simple answer. I think it's like, as I said initially a month ago, this is a policy decision from the city standpoint of there's a good chance if you change this, obviously there's not a vote tonight, and the vote would have to come in the future, but it's not just as simple as saying we're going to move it here and that'll be a done deal. It's going to be a little more work than that, just to try to figure out if that's the right place or not. But larger policy is just, is this a location that you want residential development and not non-residential development? That's the ultimate question you have to ask yourself. Staff is open to looking at this. I mean, I think it's a viable option, but there's a good chance if you change this, you may not get this back elsewhere. I guess that's the bottom line of, that's a further conversation you're going to have and try to find someplace, land someplace else. We have a finite amount of land in the city that is available. So, just like the last meeting, we do have 2 questions for the Plan Commission to consider, and ultimately, this will also go to the Common Council for discussion as well, assuming it makes it through here tonight with discussion. It would go next week, but we have 2 questions. One, is the city willing to amend the Southwest Neighborhood Plan to change the land use designation from more of an employment designation to a residential designation? And then second, the broader question regarding this development is, will the city consider 260 age-restricted units in the city, regardless of in one location? So is this something you'll consider in one location, just because there are obviously some comments from the city's senior center director. So I know the applicant is here tonight. I'm not sure if you have anything to add. Okay.
And if you could give your name and...
Yep, Matt Mothi, I'm the CEO for Marquardt Management Services. I provided to you a slide that should be on all of your screens, and wanted to address some of the comments or questions that came up in our May 7th meeting. The first is kind of coming out of that meeting, you had requested a couple of pieces of information from us. One was the market study, which I provided to you, the high level market study indicating the need for these type of services in the Verona area. And hopefully you've had a chance to look at that, or will have a chance to look at that. I also provided the slide that's on your screen to talk a little bit about the pilot payment, or what we call the payment in lieu of tax. I provided for you the template agreement that we use with the other cities that we work with throughout Wisconsin, and wanted to show on this slide the impact that would have on this development. So when you look at the 160 acres, I put the assisted living memory care in red because that building, and only that building, would we be seeking a full property tax exemption on. The buildings that are in yellow are the independent living units. Those we would wish to seek or enter into some type of negotiated pilot payment following that template that we had shared with you. And so, again, that's a situation in which we enter into a negotiated payment where we're paying for the municipal services that we utilize. And then the remainder of the development, the single-family homes, would be fully taxed. And so you can kind of get a feel for the impact that that would have tax-wise over the 160 acres. I wanted to address a little bit the senior center comments. I was surprised to see those, quite honestly. Usually we see it in reverse. The senior centers are excited about a development like this because it brings more people, sometimes brings more people to the senior center. But if you break this site down, the 160 acres, the 270 residential homes may or may not use the senior center. The assisted living and memory care would very, very rarely use the senior center. They are individuals that are advanced in age, do not drive, oftentimes are unable to leave the property. The independent living residents, the 200 units, they certainly would have access and would use the senior center. But I can tell you, these individuals are already living in and around our community now. And so they're in single-family homes that are looking to make the next step and downsize into a community like this. And so I don't believe that the impact that we would provide would be any different than what we're going to see as time goes on. The aging demographics are, in favor of increasing the number of older individuals within our community. We have not talked to the senior center staff and certainly will and can and kind of work through that with them as the project hopefully moves forward, which we'd be looking forward to doing. Any comments on any of those or questions that you have on kind of those pieces from the last meeting?
Any questions from the commission on that?
Okay. The last thing I wanted to just mention, and I'm going to ask Chad to talk about this a little bit, there is certainly some concern raised about affordability, affordable home opportunities in the city of Verona. And myself, being a resident, know that there aren't that many locations currently or buildable lots. And so Chad's going to just share some of his thoughts and visions on what could be done on this site to help ease some of that burden of not having enough affordable locations, and then we can certainly answer any other questions you have.
Hi, my name is Chad Wibben. The last time we were here, we talked about affordability and the lack thereof in the market, and to be honest with you, I am afraid of what I'm going to do in the future because the missing middle can't afford to buy my product anymore, and that scares the dickens out of me. So what we have here, and I know this is a tough development, I get it. We're climbing a big hill. But what we have here is a willing seller that wants to sell at a reasonable price, which goes a long way toward my ability to provide affordable, more affordable homes. The word affordable, I'm not even sure what that means anymore, to be honest with you. But would I like to have a place where a cop that married a teacher have good new housing with backyards for the kids? That's my goal, and I would love to find the right municipality to work with to actually achieve that. We could be a leader in Dane County on this site to achieve that type of housing for people. To that end, I want to introduce you guys to the landowner, Ben Call, who's here. I just thought I'd have him give you his thoughts quickly. If you come up, Ben. As a Verona landowner, town of Verona landowner.
Good evening. My name is Ben Call, and I'm the youngest surviving family member that owns this property. Our family has owned this land since the mid-1930s. We have listed this land for sale for development with different real estate companies since 2002. We have not received any interest for this land to be used as corporate light manufacturing or similar endeavors by the comprehensive plan, despite being actively listed for sale these past 16 years. The only prior two offers to purchase we have received were from two mining/gravel companies. My older siblings and I have, to date, shied away from this type of land use in hopes that we would instead be presented with a potential development like this for our family farm. The family supports the applicant's request and asks the Plan Commission to approve this application. Thank you.
So I'll just wrap up by saying, we're willing to do the hard work. We're just asking for your help and guidance, and we would love to work with the city of Verona, get this done. You've got some great people in the room that want to bring a lot of good to the city of Verona. Thank you.
Thank you for all the background information. Could we get the laptop back to those two questions? And then I'll open it up to questions and comments from the commission. But I just want people to be as straightforward as possible on these two questions so the applicant knows the situation. So, questions, comments? Commissioner Heinzen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have, I think, 3 overarching questions, and I'll direct it, I guess, first to Adam. But as a practical matter, we aren't really suggesting that the developer would find 160 acres someplace else because of the relationship, obviously, with the landowner here who is selling the property.
Correct. It was a hypothetical of just looking at uses just on a strictly use basis of, quite honestly, it's easier to pick up the residential piece than the non-residential. So it was a hypothetical.
Sure, I appreciate that. And then the question with, I guess the next question then is how realistic it is to find 160 acres to convert from residential to non-residential in other parts of the city. And I have 2 questions with respect to this. And the first is, again, it's a practical one. Could we find 80 in one spot and 80 in another spot that would be contiguous to other non-residential areas, and not just have to find 160 in one spot? And then I think more fundamentally, and this is a question that I should know the answer to, but I just don't, is how confident are we that in all the neighborhood plans that we do have a reasonable or appropriate mix of residential and non-residential? And this question is really, can we afford to lose 169 residential acres and not have to replace them?
So I think the first one was just where you could locate it elsewhere. I think it goes back to that southeast plan. Again, looking at those transition areas, looking at areas that are adjacent to those non-residential areas. You have 2 existing town neighborhoods you'd have to work around. Those aren't going to change, but you potentially could have some land east of there. I mean, you'd have to speak with those landowners and try to work through that, but that would be an option, probably the best option if you're looking at 80 here, 80 there, or 160. That's probably the most realistic idea that's out there. Do we have a strong comfort level overall of if we lost 160 acres of land that was planned as residential to non-residential? So if you're just flipping it, you mean if you're taking the 160 that was planned as non-residential and just locating it elsewhere?
No, I just mean if of all the property that we've identified as being non-residential, because this is 160 that is non-residential to become residential, are we confident? Is it possible or reasonable to believe that 160 acres lost to non-residential would not really need to be found elsewhere?
No, we've got. So overall, as you look at the city, I think what you're getting at, we've got more land planned as residential than anything else. We have, obviously significant amounts in the northwest, north neighborhood, in the southeast as well, even the southwest. So I mean, I'm not concerned if we lost any land that was planned as residential.
No, it's just the opposite.
The non-residential,
Right.
if we lost that.
Yeah.
That's the question. That's the ultimate question here tonight.
Yeah.
If you lost that, I still go back to my point of I don't know where you're gonna pick that up. I don't know where you reasonably pick that up. That the reason this was designated as non-residential is you're on State Highway 69. You're close to that, and you have a normal diamond interchange there that we've got 4 interchanges in the city, and this is the typical, I guess you'd say, interchanges in the city that doesn't have a skew to it, doesn't have a bend in the road. I mean, so that's why that was planned as non-residential. But if you lost that, I don't think you're gonna have a hard time picking that up. I just honestly, I think you're gonna be faced with the same conversation, trying to push that someplace else.
And one last question, if I may. How many units are in the apartments north of Pisqualls? And how does this type of, if we know, this type of an apartment complex or this type of community differ from that one?
The stuff north of Pasquale's, that's taking out Harmony Hills. I mean, that's all multifamily.
I'm sorry, the ones that are the apartments that are for senior apartments, right?
Okay.
Sorry.
So you know, No Manor, that has 111 units. The memory care facility they're building, hopefully starting building here quickly, would be 32 units just as memory care.
Okay.
So from a count standpoint, I'd have to go back and look. I might defer to the applicant because they've done market research and.
But this is about double.
Yeah,
that
overall
one.
number-wise, yes,
Yeah.
it'd be double. I mean, there is some in Prairie Oaks apartment number 2, that is a senior project that has tax credits with it. So that one also is senior just north of Pasquale's, but then you have Knoll Manor. So you have Knoll Manor at 111, the memory care at 32, and then the Prairie Oaks phase or second number 2, I think that's at 50, 60, 70 units as well. So there's roughly Sienna Ridge, but that's not senior. Yeah, but they have Willow Point, I think, up there as well too, which is memory care as well too.
Mhm.
So, yeah, number-wise,
So this
you're in about 200, 225 of just senior up there,
Right.
not counting the apartments up there, just strictly age
Right.
restricted.
So this project would be doubling what Verona has right now in that area, in that category of housing units.
I'm struggling to answer because
Okay.
at CARPC, we were doing a housing study with CARPC, and that was one of the things they asked for from us, and that's what I was actually working on today and didn't finish. So I was actually going through that today, but I don't know if we'd be doubling what we have now. I don't know. I mean, it might be similar to what we have. I think what we have now is actually more than what they're proposing here.
Okay.
But I'd have to go through and complete that
Just
analysis.
looking roughly, so
And they'll
that's
be in the
fine.
housing study when that comes forward for the plan commission.
Excellent. Okay, I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Tucker-Long.
Adam, this is a procedural question. Hypothetically, if we were going to swap, say, swap the land we have as non-residential to residential, and let's say we were going to swap the Herfel property to non-residential, what would be the procedure that would go through to sort of, I mean, how is that approached with a property like the Herfel property?
So any procedurally wise, that's a comprehensive plan amendment. So that would take an amendment to the comprehensive plan. So ultimately changing this property from non-residential to residential is also a comprehensive plan amendment. There's a variety of ways you can do that. Ideally, we'd want to sit down with the property owner ahead of time where you're making that change, so they're aware of it and get their feedback. But then there's also a 30-day public hearing notice requirement. And then goes to the Plan Commission with the public hearing, and the Plan Commission then makes a recommendation to the Common Council on the comprehensive plan amendment. Procedurally wise, though, I think how we'd want to handle this is if you're swapping or changing elsewhere, you probably want time together. And then second, you want to have some conversations with those property owners that you're making that change to and gauge their feelings on it, which we haven't done.
Commissioner Manley?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Given all of the other sort of different scenarios that you presented, to be honest, I don't like any of them. And I don't, when we look at where the Herfel property is located in relation to Scenic Ridge and Cathedral Point, I don't think it makes sense to just try and plop 160 acres of non-residential in there. I don't think it makes sense really to do that, and really good sense to do that as I look anywhere where we've currently got a residential use planned. So I guess from my standpoint, I'm struggling to answer the first question. Are we willing to change the Southwest Neighborhood Plan? Because I don't see, when we look at the map of where we have our comprehensive plan shows residential. I don't see anywhere where it looks like this is a good, you know, where moving this to one of those areas looks great either. So I think at this location, I guess I'd be willing to consider it, but I'd need to know more about what the residential property piece of it would look like. I can understand the affordable housing aspect, but there's a lot of different demands for housing stock in this city, and it isn't all just starter homes. So what I wouldn't support is taking that entire blue area on that map and saying, you know, let's, you know, make as many small lots as we possibly can and cram as many, you know, starter homes in here as we can. That, I think that'd be a mistake to do. So I think, to my mind, I would need to know a little bit more about how you would plan to develop that residential component before I can answer the first one. So it's sort of a maybe, contingent upon what that other piece looks like. In terms of the question about considering 260 age restricted units, it seems like an awful lot to me. I'm also concerned about the property tax exempt piece of it. I mean, I just know that when you're talking about older citizens, you're talking about oftentimes, you know, with ambulance calls and police calls, and if the senior center is correct and they would see higher utilization, I just think that we could see a significant demand, additional demand for services, and I just fundamentally have a concern about whether we've got 260 on board already in our city or whether it's closer to 300. They're all delivering these types of services, and they're paying property taxes. And I just get concerned about saying, you know, this particular establishment has to pay property taxes and this establishment doesn't have to. And I just think we need to be mindful of that. If we're gonna trade property that we've already said as a city ought to be non-residential, and we're gonna make that leap and trade it to a residential use, but then to not have, you know, to have much of it property tax exempt, and I get the pilot thing, and you know, that's great, but even with the pilot, you're not paying the full amount of property taxes. And so I think that that's a concern that we should be thinking about in the bigger picture of, does it make sense to change a non-residential use to a residential use?
Thank you. Further comments, questions? Commissioner Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to appreciate the sort of final comment from the applicant about good people involved. I certainly feel that in this, and thanks to the property owner for those words. And this is certainly in my opinion, a preferable use to something like a mining operation. So appreciate the effort here. You know, a month to think about this, and the additional details are very helpful. You know, I think last time we were sort of a maybe, but need more information. Yeah, as to sort of the first question, I think the context for the Southwest Neighborhood Plan is perhaps changed since it was written and passed, with the high school being nearby, development on the south side of 151 that's happened. That perhaps a residential use makes more sense here. I sort of share Commissioner Manley's concerns about losing some of that, and comments from others as well, losing that sort of diversity in our land use, and just smart planning would dictate to have a good diversity of uses available. So I mean, I think I would like to see what options look like for a comprehensive plan amendment to swap some of the residential for non-residential, agreeing that there's no perfect option for it. Perhaps we can find something along the lines of Commissioner Heinzen's comments, I think it was, of parts here, parts there, to piece it together to get to that same amount or something close to it. And on question 2, I think the details on the market study was helpful. That was something I asked for, so thank you to the applicant. And perhaps an issue more for the city council than for this body, but the seeming conflict in opinions on the demand and what this would do to the senior center. Perhaps a sort of meeting between the applicant and that director would make some sense, but get some clarity there for this decision or for question number 2 there. But I think the applicant wouldn't be here without the confidence and the demand for the senior center to the numbers that were thrown around. If we're at 250 or 300, I think there is demand, and they wouldn't be here with this sort of proposal without that confidence. So, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Tucker-Long?
As far as question number 1, I'm very concerned about losing the non-residential land. As we look at the map, we don't have a lot of it in comparison to how much residential we have. And I don't want us to get into a situation where we have so much residential but nothing for the people to do while they're here, or no place for them to work besides Epic. And as awesome as Epic is, I want to make sure we have land that we can bring other things into town as well. So for me, for question 1, I would really rather see land swapped rather than just changed. And I like the Herfel property because it's close by. It's right by that same interchange, and the property is big enough that we could perhaps get 160 acres of non-residential use and add in some transitional property to buffer before getting into the residential areas again, because it's much larger than 160 acres. Well, not much larger, but it is larger. So it could provide a nice transitional area, whereas if we take it from some of the other areas, the non-residential would bump right up against the residential if we try to get exactly 160 acres out of it. So I'd rather see, if we are going to be changing it on people who've already purchased property nearby, I'd rather see some transitional in between as a buffer. I also want to thank the landowner for coming out. It carries great weight for me to know that the landowner with personal ties to the property is in favor of this project. I think that's important, and if we can find a way to make it work, I think that carries weight. As far as the second question, the 260 age-restricted units, I mean, the numbers do support that we need this, and it seems to be done in a nice way. I like that it's mixed age usage and that they're trying to create a community for these age-restricted units not just being isolated off by themselves, but creating sort of a community for them to still interact with is really nice. So I feel like it's being done in a nice way. I'm also concerned a little bit about the tax exempt status, but I'm happy to hear that it's only the one building. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Further comments from Alder Gaskell?
So, Mr. Sayre, a question for you, please. We keep talking about swapping 160 acres, but if we were to do that for this parcel, we're leaving remnants. Is that accurate? So we're really not looking at 160 switch, because if you just look at the way that this is laid out, we've got these remnant pieces. Would they still be classified non-residential?
Well, correct. I think that's part of the conversation too, is you kind of look, and this is the southwest plan, so you have the property we're discussing tonight. You still have the pieces to the south as well, and then you have the pieces abutting State Highway 69. I mean, ultimately, you may have to look at, depending on how that lays out, you may have to look at changing that to some type of transition as well too, potentially. So yeah, to your point, yes, it may not be a swap of 160. It could be additional 100 acres, 80 acres in there, depending on what that is.
And then if we propose this swap, how does that affect the current landowners who are maybe looking at the fact that down the road they've got property deemed residential, which I assume has a higher land value?
Yeah, those are conversations we'd obviously have to have with the property owners. I think it depends on the property owners. Some have different feelings. Some will, I don't know. That's the short answer, but it's gonna have to be a conversation with those owners as well, if you're trying to swap it.
Additional questions, comments from the Plan Commission? I'll add for myself, as far as the questions go, tentative yes to both of them. Without having seen a final plan, I can't commit to supporting any project, of course. But I'd be willing to see the land use changed, and I'd be willing to see the age-restricted units go in there as well. I think we do need more senior housing in Verona. Just getting back to what I said about the single-family homes, I would like to see a minimum density of 4 lots per acre there, just to make sure we're getting the highest and best use out of our land, because at some point we will run out of land to build. So that's my thoughts on the issue. I did have one question for Mr. Sayer, which might be difficult to answer, but this has been kind of an ongoing theme where we've had areas zoned industrial and other things, and everyone comes back to us and wants to rezone them as residential. Is there something we could do as a city, or anything in like, why does this keep happening, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Why? I would, it's a function of the market right now. I mean, if you look at the market, I mean, apartments, obviously a lot of demand, single family, a lot of demand. Quite honestly, office in the Madison region is soft. Industrial, quite honestly, there's a lot of competition. I mean, so as you look at residential, obviously Verona has a good school district. I mean, so people want to be here for the schools. It's got a nice setting from you're close to Madison, but you're not in Madison, and if you want to get out in the country, you're 5-10 minutes from basically being out in the middle of nowhere. So I mean, there's a lot of things, especially from a living standpoint, that are going for it. But I'd say it's a lot of market dynamics, but it's also that people want to live here. So want to live someplace. I mean, that obviously drives a lot, and I'm sure companies and businesses want to be here as well, but they're not technically bound by, I have kids and I need to look at what school district I'm going into, versus a business looking at where my employees live and work and what I'm going to pay for property taxes and whatnot. So I would say it's more a function of market and right now, and just the function of that the city has a lot of good things going for it, especially if you want to live here. So that's just my personal opinion. I could be wrong too, but that's my take.
Thanks. Yeah, it was kind of a tough question. Further comments, questions? Has everyone weighed in on the 2 questions before us? Sorry. Commissioner Tucker-Long.
One more question. You brought up that, we've been getting, I'm new to the council, so we've been getting a lot of requests to convert non-residential to residential. How much have we converted in like the last couple of years?
I don't know what the number is. I think in Liberty Park, when we changed, it wasn't a conversion from, it was a change from non-residential to commercial. I want to say that was 20 acres in Liberty Park. We looked at a proposal down there for a mixed-use project that would have had commercial and apartments above. Obviously, Lincoln Street across the street here is zoned non-residential, Locust Drive. I'm thinking as I'm talking. Sugar Creek Commons, I mean, it's a mixed-use project from it's got commercial in it, but it's going to have apartments on it. We've looked at, obviously, the stuff in the West End that was planned initially as big box retail, and obviously now the high school's going there. The challenge with, especially with commercial nowadays too, I think we've all seen too, is nobody really knows where it's going. I mean, traditional commercial is changing from what it was, and it's part of the challenge. People are still living in houses, they're still living in apartments. That hasn't changed, but you have some interesting dynamics right now, especially in that commercial, non-commercial market that is, nobody really knows for sure which way it's going to go and how it's going to end up, but those are the ones off the top of my head that we've looked at. I mean, there might be more, but that's the initial ones.
Commissioner Heinzen?
Thank you. One last question, I think, for Adam on this. If you could take a look, I guess, at page 12 of this report, in your table 2. And, so I just have a couple questions about this, but what's the difference between total acres and vacant acres? Such as the vacant are the ones that can be built upon, or?
Yeah, vacant has nothing on it, so it's actually vacant, no buildings on it. So we have total acres that, the total raw number of just, that includes vacant and land has buildings on it. So as we looked at vacant, those are properties that would have nothing on it, and somebody could buy that parcel. And
Okay. Okay. And as I understand this, then, is it fair to say that right now there's 656 total vacant acres of non-residential property that can be developed in the city right now?
no.
Okay.
That would be 656. That would be in the city and also within our neighborhood plans. And that takes out Epic as well. We didn't want to look at Epic or anything that was contemplated potentially for Epic. So that 656 is in the municipality and also within that, or other plans too. And that's looking at industrial and also looking at non-residential, so not commercial, just those industrial and non-residential type classifications.
Okay, so there is additional non-residential that the city has available.
No, not from a neighborhood planning standpoint. I
Okay.
mean, there could be, I mean, we lumped into the, I think potentially in the industrial, we also, but I'm not sure if we put office into that too. We did, so yes, and we talked about that. So yeah, that's also includes some of the office classifications we have, which isn't much.
Okay.
There's a little bit of office as well.
So my question ultimately is just curiously, do you have a sense of how many acres is developed in that category annually over the last number of years? I mean, how long would 650 acre how long will 650 acres last for the city?
It's tough. I mean, it's tough because you have potentially some users that come in and take, when we talked about CDI, they're looking at a 20-acre piece. And then you have other users down in, Technology Park or Liberty Park that might take an acre and a half or 2 acres. So it's a function of land price, it's a function of market, it's a function of a lot of things. So it's not a typical absorption that you can look at a single family project and say, okay, phase 1 is going to have this, and they all typically have a certain number of lots in that phase because that's how many the market will support. I mean, it doesn't go like that typically in non-residential because you also have, economic development tools with TIF conversations, and that could play into of municipal assistance on potentially, building roads or doing something that might spur additional development. And there's forces out there that are it's different. It's completely different. You can't, unfortunately, you can't quantify it.
A lot of variation from year to
year. Yeah, I mean, you could go a year and you could have an acre or 2 developed, and you can go the next year and you land a big business and you can have 40, 50 acres developed. I mean, if you go up to Forest and see what they're doing, I mean, they've got industrial buildings going up all over the place. So it depends. It depends on a lot of things. There's not a clear answer to that. No.
All right, thanks.
Additional questions, comments? To the applicants, do you feel like you've gotten enough feedback? Yeah. From the Plan Commission?
Well, it sounds like a very firm maybe. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
But I don't hear. I hear like we have some more work to do, which we all know. I'm curious as to what the next steps would be because we can continue planning, and maybe that feedback I could use. What should we do next? Should we go to council, or do you not want us to do that until you have given a more firm nod, or should we'd love to have a basic conversation with them just to see.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to go to the council, so
Okay.
it'll be on the agenda next week, Monday.
I think we'll take that step next, and then we'll go from there.
Great.
Thank you all very much.
Fantastic. And with that, we are on to item 10, reports and comments from the Planning Department. Part A, update on development projects.
I'm sure once again in your packet there was an update on development projects. Happy to answer any questions you have on that. Just a general update of kind of what's happening in the city and what the status of buildings are.
Any questions from the commission? Seeing none. 10B, update on future zoning ordinance amendments. Mr.
Alright.
Sayer.
Thank you. So the next item is, this planning staff and Mayor Diaz met to discuss potential zoning changes. Those are listed in the memo that was in the Plan Commission packet. I'll real briefly just kind of go through a few things that we're looking at. The first one is just looking at building setbacks and looking at possibly trying to potentially reduce some of the required setbacks in all districts, just to take a look at where we're at with our building setbacks and see if we can make some improvements to that. Density, just to potentially look at allowing greater flexibility and potentially single-family homes, looking at a minimum lot size requirement and minimum maximum density requirements as well. Landscaping, looking at our landscaping ordinance to see if we can provide greater encouragement, especially the use of native plantings. We've talked about maximum parking before, but trying to bring that back to the Plan Commission again, that's going to take probably some significant changes just in how we classify uses, but trying to look at that and see if we can bring back that forward. And then finally, the Architectural Review Commission, which I know Mayor Diaz brought up at the last council meeting, but looking at just repealing that, just because I know in my 5.5 years here, it's never met, just reducing the redundancy in the code of something that hasn't met. So staff is going to be putting this together. There's no real set order of how we're doing this. Obviously, it's going to depend on what other development projects we have come forward. Those will take priority over this, but I mean, we want to start bringing forward a few of these changes, at least for the initial conversation with the Plan Commission, to get your feedback, and then when we're ready to go forward then with the public hearing and ultimately looking at some potential ways we can make some improvements and modifications to the code. So, like I said, those will be coming forward in the next, hopefully, month or two.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Sayer? All right, we're on to number 11, reports and comments from the Plan Commissioners. Anyone have any reports or comments? All right, item 12, adjournment. A motion to adjourn would be in order. Motion by Commissioner Manley. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Tucker Long. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. And we are adjourned. Thank you.